Hey folks, uh, here's a good story. Doing a bit of a cold open here. Um, here's a good story. This story comes from a guy named Procopius. Procopius basically translates as hard charger, and he is a Byzantine dude and maybe the last great ancient historian who writes about wars, quote unquote, that is Justinian, the emperor of Byzantium's unprovoked invasion of everywhere in the mid 6th century CE. So we're in late antique territory here. Well, in this case, Justinian's target is Africa, which, to be fair, Vandals are vandalizing, literal Vandals are vandalizing at this point in history. So the Africans are not too happy being ruled by this tribe of, from their point of view, barbarians. Definitely not the right kind of Christian by Roman standards. The Vandals are Arians rather than Nicene Christians, so there's a bit of a religious conflict there as well. But, you know, the Byzantines don't have that many friends in Africa. They have this problem where, you know, there are a lot of people in the hinterland of North Africa who were never actually conquered by the Romans, who don't particularly sympathize with the Romans hanging out and running things. And so they're just as interested in hassling the new rulers, the Byzantines, as they were in stealing from the Vandals when they had the chance. These people, called collectively the Maori by Procopius, occasionally some other tribal designations get brought up. The Maori are constantly beating the Romans' ass, kicking them all over the place. They can't really go too far out of a town without getting pillaged by the Maori, who we suspect are probably Berbers, but who did Procopius think they were? Procopius has a rather interesting answer. Procopius believes that they are Phoenician refugees that had to leave the Holy Land, that had to leave the Levant, because the Hebrews were invading. This is like Bible stuff. And so they fled the Hebrews and ended up in the desert in North Africa 2,000 years later, killing the Romans. Weird idea for Procopius to have. How does he get this idea? There's, of course, modern historical methods by looking at an inscription. He says he saw an inscription that confirmed his case, and it confirms his case in two different ways. One, because it just says like what he claims, says something he claims. It says something that backs up his interpretation of history. Namely, we are those who fled from before the face of Joshua the robber, son of Nun. But the other way is kind of interesting too. Procopius says this thing is written in Phoenician or Punic lettering. So clearly the people who wrote it must be refugees from Phoenicia. These are the 2 points of evidence in favor of Procopius's obviously crazy interpretation. But he's not wrong to have claims to see inscriptions in some kind of Punic or Phoenician lettering in North Africa. There were quite a lot of those. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today on still your #1 Google Slides live stream in Santa Cruz County, but streaming today from Center County, Pennsylvania. All the way from the other coast, coming at you extremely serious down those internet wires. Well, so when Procopius says, I saw a Punic inscription, what does that mean? What is Punic? Well, Punic can be a lot of things. Punic can refer to a place or a people or an empire, right? A set of people migrating and colonizing from the Levant, from modern Lebanon and Syria and Israel, Phoenicia, ancient Phoenicia, and they go all over the place. We have talked before on this live stream about how the Greeks colonized a lot of the Mediterranean. Well, at about the same time, the Phoenicians are doing the same thing. In fact, Phoenician is an exonym. That is a name that's applied from the outside. It's a name that is applied by the Greeks to a group of people who are united by culture and language, possibly because of their traffic in the date tree or the Phoenix, but more likely because of their production of purple dye, which is also called Phoenix in Greek. The so-called Tyrian or royal purple of the Romans comes from Phoenician craftsmen or Punic craftsmen. It's not clear that there is one name that all of the people who are in these colonies use to refer to themselves. They just refer to themselves by local names for the most part. It's an area that's united linguistically, but not necessarily politically, much the same way that Greece is. So there's this word Phoenician, and it gets scrambled through the old Italic language mill, and in Latin it turns out as Punic, Punicus, Punica. The Romans used that word, Punicus, to refer primarily to Carthaginians. Inhabitants of Carthage and its empire. It is the dominant Punic-speaking Punic cultural center that Romans will deal with, because it's certainly the closest one to Italy. It builds up this federal state in Africa, which in many ways resembles the sort of federal state that the Romans are building up in Italy, sort of building these unequal alliances with all of their neighboring tribes and cities. Carthage is doing kind of something similar in Italy, and it catches a few mentions in Aristotle's Politics, actually, for this strategy. Aristotle's Politics is a book on, as you might expect, constitutions, politics. He does not really approve of these federal strategies as a way of making states. He thinks that they really just have to be individual city-states, polis. But his example for these strategies of state building by federalism is not, as we might have imagined, Rome, of which it's not clear he'd ever heard, but Carthage. Carthage and Rome are a bit of a mirror image in that respect. Now, Carthage gets into Sicily and Italy a bit, and there are a series of fights over influence in Sicily and then influence in Spain. Not really the place to tell that story here, but Carthage, as you probably know, loses the so-called Punic Wars. And this brings the inscriptional tradition in Punic, so-called, to an end. There are not really a lot more inscriptions in the official state language of Carthage, of the Punic Empire, in Carthage at least, after the Punic Wars. The city was depopulated, for one thing. Romans have kind of an influence in not letting these local traditions of monumentalization and even self-governance continue. However, the language, the Punic language, survives, and it makes this interesting transition from a colonial language, one imposed from the outside, to one of a series of indigenous languages. The alphabet transforms pretty radically, as you can see if we contrast the previous slide and this one. Same set of letters, but written in a very different script style. Much more almost graffito-esque style of script. So the written record in Punic continues in a new alphabet, with quite an extensive distribution, as this chart suggests, although this chart actually is missing a few fine sites, because there are also Neo-Punic inscriptions in Greece and in Italy, of all places. So it almost becomes a pan-Mediterranean language, not one that was spoken all over the Mediterranean, but one which people who traveled the Mediterranean spoke after the fall of Carthage. So like I said, this involves a change in status. Prior to the end of the Punic Wars, Punic as a language and as a written language is the dominant script in North Africa. It represents political power, imperial power. After the Punic Wars, this is no longer the case. There are no longer big public inscriptions in Punic, as there had been at an earlier date. Most inscriptions turn out to be for more private concerns, private dedication of altars or tombstones, the most common ones. Quite a lot of those have survived to the present day. Some inscriptions are still of a quasi-public nature, those altar designations, although undertaken in the name of private donors, are for public display. And at this time, Punic also gets legal recognition as one of the languages in which you can use to file legal paperwork, basically, under Roman law, alongside Greek and, I believe, Gallic. This kind of resurgence in a more private sort of context, but even one that's recognized by the Roman state, is a compromise regarding a language which is useful for governance once it's no longer the symbol of a political rival of Rome. So these changes in status also correlate with changes in the language itself. For one thing, the language starts to have a lot more calques and borrowings, both from Latin and Greek, as one might expect in a situation in which those are the dominant languages, and from the so-called Libico-Berber language, which is likely a language spoken by the Maori, aforementioned, likely a linguistic antecedent of modern Berber languages. Some words are borrowed, and a lot more Libico-Berber names start showing up in the inscriptions, indicating that this language, Neo-Punic, was used by Libico-Berber peoples as well, either because it was a language they spoke, language in which they communicated on a daily basis, or because it was a prestige written language. Hard to say which one is the case. But possibly as a consequence of both these developments, the use of the language by more diverse populations, lack of a state control of the language, introduction of borrowings, there are actually a lot of spelling changes that happen at this point over the transition between Punic and Neo-Punic as well. For one thing, the so-called pharyngeal consonants, things like and ro, go away. These consonants, which are characteristic of Semitic languages, of which Punic is one, but which speakers of Latin or Greek, and even Berber, in fact, are less familiar with. So those disappear. And at the same time, the letters that had been used to represent them get used to indicate where vowels are, which is nice, right? If you're reading a language and you're not super familiar with it, it's nice to have the vowels in there for you. Normally, Semitic alphabets do not contain vowels and do not indicate vowels, meaning you've got to be kind of familiar with the language, even at an expert level of speaking, to read the script. You have to be able to supply the vowels yourself on the basis of the consonant. If the vowels are written in explicitly, as they are in Neo-Punic, then the written language becomes much easier to acquire and easier to use, both for illiterate people and for people whose first language is not Neo-Punic. So, for example, in Punic, you would spell the word hawa with an H and a W, no vowels, but you do indicate the pharyngeal. In Neo-Punic, the same word is spelled awa with two markers for the vowels and no sign for that initial laryngeal. Now, it's hard to tell whether that initial laryngeal was in fact not pronounced Probably it was not, because the script is otherwise quite explicit about indicating what's pronounced and what's not. So the spelling change here also indicates a change in pronunciation. So in many ways, Neo-Punic is not just a different alphabet, but a different language, or a different stage of the language than Punic pre-Punic Wars. Despite all the inscriptions themselves and the formulae that they contain, still transmit like quite a lot of the old culture. You get a lot of theonyms. You get a series of formulas like Shamakala, which I don't have a slide for, but I probably should. Shamakala, he heard my voice. It's a dedicatory formula explaining why somebody set up an altar to Baal or Malkart or whoever. They say, well, Shamakala, he heard my voice. He answered a prayer of mine. So these theonyms and these dedicatory formulas persist from Old Punic into Neo-Punic. There's some experimentation, calques on Latin. The thing that is on the screen right now is a Latin inscription, apparently written in Latin first, pretty obviously written in Latin first, and then back translated into Punic. But you also get some interesting experimentations with writing the Neo-Punic language using Greek letters. This you see in a few places as well, in North Africa even. It's a way of bringing the inscription even to a larger audience. And here actually you can see that Samakala formula that I mentioned. In Greek it's Samokulo, which suggests something interesting about how the language was actually pronounced at the time. Samokulo, in that particular area of North Africa. He heard his voice, protected him. That's Baal Hamon who's doing that work there. Baal Ammon, the same as Zeus Ammon, one of the Zeuses who is supposedly an oracle in the Greek world. Well, so with this set of developments, changes to the language that go along with Neo-Punic, the scope of transmission actually broadens, because you've got new alphabets, you've got these bilingual audiences who can read the inscriptions, and inscriptional activity in Neo-Punic persists until quite late. Some of these inscriptions are 4th, 5th century CE. And St. Augustine actually confirms in a letter that Punic is spoken in the back country around his parish of Hippo. He says that clergy who's working in the countryside should know Punic so that they can preach in Punic and communicate with parishioners who are Punic, who don't necessarily know Latin even. So in this case, one kind of wonders if I don't know how we should read what Procopius says about this Punic inscription, because he recognizes that it is Punic, but he obviously has no idea what it says. It is possible that he just does not get it because he's a clown. He's an outsider. He's not native to the region. Somebody, a local could even have mistranslated it for him as a joke. That's possible. So it's hard to know what Procopius's obvious mistranslation tells us about the status of Punic at that point in history. Well, he is writing a kind of survivor's history. And that is a form of history that has been, gosh, I don't know, a pretty popular one, even in high school textbooks. You might have read this kind of history. It's a kind of history that, like, makes the past out to be this sort of a battle royale where one empire destroys another, and then that second empire is just out of the game. It's like a game of civilization or something. And at the end, there can be only one. There can be only one winner. This is not the way that it works in point of fact. It doesn't actually work that way. Most of the time, most people from an empire that has ceased to be a coherent political entity or has been subsumed by another still survive. The people survive. And the world doesn't end for them. It may not even change all that much for these survivors because they're just getting taxed by someone else, right? You know, your average Punic peasant. Do they care that their empire has been knocked over by Rome? Well, probably not. They're just paying taxes to a little bit further away. Residents of Carthage care because they get massacred or sold into slavery, but people living in the countryside, the people who are still speaking Punic 600 years later, they might not even notice. The world doesn't change all that much for them. Now, this kind of battle royale version of history tends to erase those survivors because they're complicated. The history that happens after the end of their empire, the collapse of that particular political unit, is really complicated and it's difficult to track. But the epigraphical evidence, the evidence of inscriptions, is one of the ways that we can track it. And it's this stubborn kind of thing that forces us to remember that Punic people did not disappear when the Punic Wars were over, any more than, say, the Vandals will disappear when Justinian finishes rolling through, or any more than the Romans will disappear when the Muslims conquer North Africa in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. In fact, the earliest written evidence for a Romance language, a language descended from Latin but different than Latin, comes from an Arabic text that records the stuff that, you know, these backcountry rubes who are still Christian in modern Morocco, in the Maghreb, say. So there's even this kind of proto-Romance that forms there, although it eventually dies out with the increasing Islamicization and dominance of Arabic in the Maghreb. These traces force us to kind of confront these survivors' histories and to look a little bit more closely at these lost worlds. Well, thanks for listening, and I'll catch everyone back here next week. Same day, maybe same time. Who knows?